All right, let's get started. Welcome back. We've had a little bit of a hiatus, but welcome back to the Constitutional Transitions Colloquium, which I'm co-convening with Sujit, Choudhry here. And today our guest is Professor Asli Bâli from the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law. So I'll just introduce her, and as is typical, she'll speak for 10 minutes or so, and then I'll open up with a question, and then open it up to Sujit if he has any questions, and then to all of you. So Professor Bâli, as I said, she's an assistant professor at UCLA School of Law, where she teaches. Her teaching and research focus is on public international law, issues of non-proliferation, and human rights and humanitarian law. She also has a strong interest in the comparative law of the Middle East. She used to convene the Middle East Legal Forum at Yale Law School. She's a regular participant of the Middle East Legal Studies Seminar, which convenes every year somewhere in the Middle East to discuss ongoing issues, in part with Yale Law School. And I see some participants from that seminar here as well, aside from Asli Bâli. And she is one of the faculty advisors to the Journal of International and Near Eastern Law at UCLA. So she has an impressive academic and legal trajectory. She's very humble, so I'm sorry in advance for embarrassing her. She has degrees from 5 different institutions or departments, where I was privileged to overlap with her at 2 of them in my attempt to follow in her footsteps. She graduated summa cum laude from Williams College with her BA. She earned an MPhil degree from Emmanuel College at Cambridge University with a focus on social and political theory. She got her JD from Yale Law School, where she served both on journals, the Yale Law Journal, the Yale Journal of International Law, and the Yale Journal of Human Rights and Development, and where she did work in the clinics extensively at the Lowenstein International Human Rights Clinic and the Jerome Frank Legal Services Organization, where she focused on immigration issues. And along with her law degree, she also completed an MPA from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. And then she practiced for 5 years with Cleary here in New York, where she managed to have a large part of her practice deal with pro bono issues and get paid for it. She had corporate clients as well. And after all that, she then earned a PhD in political science from Princeton University, the Department of Politics, where her dissertation focused on enforcement issues in the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty system. So she brings all of that learning and experience to bear in her many publications, of which I'll just mention 2 that are relevant here that were published last year. One is Pax Arabica, Provisional Sovereignty and Intervention in the Arab Uprisings. And the second is one that was cited in this paper, and some of you students commented on it in your response papers, The Perils of Judicial Independence, Constitutional Transition, and the Turkish Example. So today she'll talk to us about a paper she's written called A Kemalist Secular Age, Negotiating the Islam-Modernity Binary in Turkey.
Great. Well, okay, so I've got 7 to 10 minutes. I hope I can compete with the length of that bio in my remarks. So the first thing I want to say, which I was just mentioning to Professor Choudhry, is that this isn't the paper I'd intended to present to this group. The paper I'd wanted to present to this group at the time that I was first invited, I anticipated writing on the draft Turkish constitution, which should have emerged in November of 2012, and hasn't. And actually, there's a whole paper to be written on the process over the last 18 months of how that basically different commissions and then later different processes for inclusion of the public and so forth in that process have unfolded. But that's not really what I'm most interested in that process. It's the draft itself, which will be, in some ways, I hope, an answer to some of the questions raised here towards the end about what kind of negotiation we might see between competing elites at this point in Turkey over the nature of the constitution of the polity in a new iteration. But we don't have that text before us, and we don't have the account of those internal debates yet, and so I wasn't able to write what I had hoped to present to you because of events. And so this is a different project that's somewhat related to the kinds of concerns that animate this colloquium series, and also, as I understand it, your clinic, which grows out of an entirely different set of engagements. And those engagements date back to my time at the Yale Law School when I was a postdoctoral fellow there. And Charles Taylor came out with his book, A Secular Age, and it was widely celebrated. And indeed, it was celebrated very intensely at Yale itself with multiple different conferences and workshops in his honor, inviting him to come speak and address audiences of people who've been engaging with him over the decades in his project. But what was striking about the project was, and this has been commented on already from one perspective, was the total kind of the approach that suggests that Latin Christendom can be studied in a hermetically sealed fashion, so that even if you're interested in confining ideas to either A, populations that are themselves adherents of Latin Christendom, or B, territories that are characterized by Latin Christendom, the approach suggests that you don't have to know anything about the encounters of those populations or territories with the rest of the world. There have been criticisms of this that have been launched previously that look at the trajectory of history of ideas trajectory of European thought and the ways in which Europeans themselves have been influenced by those external encounters. What I am participating in is a group of social scientists and theorists who are interested in the other side of that story, which is the ways in which these ideas, this trajectory has migrated, emigrated, been projected, been exported, and the life it has taken on outside of the West, so the other side of the encounter, how the East has been marked. And again, I'm using these, and all of the language, conceptual terms I use are shorthands. I try to signal that in some footnotes in this piece. I don't mean to suggest Islam is univocal, modernity is univocal, any of these things. I just don't have time to complicate those concepts as part. I'm not giving an elaborate intellectual history here or a genealogy of those ideas. I'm just trying to think about how they have traveled in one particular context, but this will be a chapter in a book that draws together a number of authors looking at India, Senegal, Israel, Japan, and the list goes on, of non-Western contexts that have encountered these ideas either in imperial form, colonial form, or post-colonial form, and have internalized them in particular constitutional and legal orderings. So my interest here is, of course, in the Turkish context. But first, I lay out a little bit of edifice of what it is that Charles Taylor was doing. And one of the key, I think, takeaways that's worth highlighting just for the purposes of this discussion, and those of you who read the paper, of course, saw this, is that he comes up with a typology that's threefold of secularity, as he calls it. And I can say something in the Q&A if you want about how secularity, secularism, and secularization interact as ideas in his work. But secularity 1 is identified with what most social scientists study, which is institutional differentiation, secularization as the separation of church and state, essentially. Secularity 2 is what many sociologists study, which is decline in religiosity, decline in belief, which, as I say, I dispense with that pretty quickly in this paper because I don't think anybody can really argue that the Turkish polity is characterized by a widespread decline in the population in belief, and therefore that's not a relevant category of secularity that's encountered there. And then the third, which is distinctive to Charles Taylor, is this idea of the changing conditions of belief. And here I thought there might be something fruitful to pursue in thinking about the coincidence of, in the Turkish context at least, the nation-building project, which was a strong social engineering project that I try to give a sort of mapping of, with a very strong commitment to secularization, the process, the sociological process, as part of state building. And that seems to me to actually get that dimension of secularization is better captured by this concept of secularity 3 that Charles Taylor introduces than most other accounts, social science accounts of secularization as a process. And so that already is a sort of fruitful avenue, but embedded in a critique of Taylor. And that critique says basically that by virtue of confining yourself to one particular strand of the trajectory, the intellectual tradition that you're mapping, you fail to see the many different variations through which these concepts of secularity might intertwine and produce different outcomes than what you expect. So if his account, as I try to characterize it in this paper, suggests that what secularity is a function of the confrontation of a polity with democratic diversity, with pluralization in conditions of belief that is occurring autonomously from the state, on his account in the West, and the state is then confronted with how to govern, governance challenges associated with pluralism that then produces this idea of institutional differentiation. What you have in the Turkish context is quite the opposite. I suggest what you have here is a state that's forming in a period of post-imperial collapse in which the sort of diagnosis of principal elites engaged in the state formation process of the reasons for that collapse are related to diversity and pluralism. They understand the heterogeneity of the empire to have been a source of its weakness, and they're extremely committed in the process of state formation to essentially generating a homogenous polity that can sustain their state project. And they think this is important for a number of reasons. First of all, because they genuinely believe that plurality or diversity is a threat to territorial integrity, that they will continue to have the problem that the Ottoman Empire was plagued by, which is that parts of the territory, peripheries, will keep basically seceding and declaring independence on the basis of their own separate loyalties and affiliations, and they want to stamp that out. But they also think that it's necessary to produce a kind of new Turk or a new concept of national identity or loyalty that will generate social cohesion for the rump part of the Anatolia, the territory of the Ottoman Empire that's left to the Republic. And this project for them is essential to sustain not only the territorial integrity of the state, but also the particular modernization strategy they believe is necessary to enable this republic to survive the pressures of its ongoing encounters with Europe and with the West. So given this approach that they take, they have two different orientations to religion. On the one hand, the model of modernity that they embrace requires a privatized concept of religion. So they get invested in secularization in the kind of secularity one sense, except in a very weak sense. So they want institutional differentiation. They want religion relegated to the private realm, but they want to do this through the production of an appropriate kind of state-sanctioned private religious identity. And that private religious identity is to serve a second function, which is to be the content or part of the content of this new ethnic category that they're inventing to secure national allegiance. So this category that everybody, all the population left on the territory, is supposed to identify with, the content of being a Turk, which, as I suggest here, ends up being a kind of variant of Sunni Hanafi affiliation, but as reinterpreted by the state to be a kind of Protestant Sunnism, if you want. So the state is invested in producing religion. This is completely in tension with what Charles Taylor means, or what most people mean when they describe anything associated with secularism or secularity. And secondly, they're invested in privatizing that religion in a kind of disestablishmentarian vein, a la, modeled in part, but not entirely on French institutional forms of secularization. So so in the first part of this paper, I just try to give a sense of what that relationship between modernization and the state-building project and Islam looks like, and the ways in which it may pick up on, but really also be in deep tension with the kinds of trajectory that somebody like Taylor would want to propose, or more generally that we typically read about in accounts of Western secularization. And then I introduce a set of complications. And those complications are the moment at which, having engaged in this initial state-building project, the state confronts a set of pressures that require liberalization. Those are external pressures, some of them including the requirements of economic reform, including the demand following the end of World War II that the state moved to a multi-party system, including the state's own goals of EU accession, which bring with them not just economic, but also human rights conditions and so forth, conditionality for accession purposes. So external pressures, but also some internal demographic shifts that take place in Turkey beginning in the 1950s, but that really come to a head as a result of liberalizing reforms that are adopted in the economy in the 1980s that give rise to a new kind of political and social clout for the Turkish periphery that was excluded from that state-building project. And when I say excluded, I don't mean that they were literally politically excluded, but rather that the cultural reforms and social engineering project centered on urban Turkey and really didn't penetrate as deeply and didn't witness the same degree of state investment in rural parts of the country or provincial parts of the country where you had large proportions of the population. So this is an incredibly fast shorthand to that history that I try to trace, which suggests why it is that the founding debates and the founding political bargain and the cultural politics associated with that bargain have been reopened as a new set of living debates in the contemporary period in Turkey that now are being revisited largely by an emergent elite that does not share the underlying ideological commitment to the project that the state founding elites had. And then that is the second part of the paper, which is looking at how the reemergence of those debates in the contemporary period, the form and trajectory they've taken, and how the production of a kind of local alternative model of what modern might mean by way of definition, what secular might mean by way of definition, and indeed what national adherence looks like, has emerged in these contemporary debates. And I focus on two areas, which were extremely important at the founding. So first, the role of women in the public sphere and the state's role in emancipating women in a variety of ways from traditional understandings and cultural practices of Islam, which is kind of a history I try to tell in very briefly, telegraph, in the first part, and then return to through the headscarf debates before Turkish courts in the 1980s, 90s, and to this day. And then the second part is the core critical role played by public education and conceptions of a unified, homogeneous national curriculum that the state invested in at the founding that was intended to secularize and produce this modern citizenry, basically educate the populace in the ideological commitments of the elite founders of the state, and then the reopening of debates about the role of religion in that public educational model in the contemporary period. And again, I traced the ups and downs and ebbs and flows of different models of incorporating religion in public education, either through vocational religious training or through formal courses on religion in public education. And again, bearing in mind that this is a state invested in the production of a particular kind of state-sanctioned Islam, it stands to reason that the secular state, in its instantiation of secularism, is pursuing religious education in a variety of guises. The question is, how does it do that, and how do competing elites then contest those efforts and seek themselves to use access to the levers of power in the state to redefine the pedagogical goals of the secular state? So that sort of is a mapping of what I tried to do in this project. At the end, what I suggest is that, in a sense, the kind of counter-elites that I try to trace, these much more religiously conservative elites that emerge out of the rising middle classes of the provinces and who themselves are largely graduates of religious vocational education in the 70s and 80s, have begun to contest these concepts in ways that may prove to suggest that they are both accidental Democrats. And for those of you who read the earlier piece, you'll recognize this phrase and this idea that I'm not suggesting intentionality, that these are committed democratizers or committed liberalizers that are seeking to embrace a much more pluralistic concept of secularism, but rather that the challenges they face and the particular debates that they're trying to navigate have placed them in positions where, for one reason or another, they have caused the system to the kind of univocal attempts to come up with a single set of ideological commitments to fragment. And that fragmentation has generated political contestation, which itself has democratic potential and also liberalizing potential. So in this particular piece, I look at its implications for the state's conception of secularism and the direction that might take. Now, as I said at the very beginning, I'll be able to do a better job of accounting for that if we had a new constitution or a new clearly stated conception of the current snapshot of where the state and society are in the debate over what secularism should be, what its content should be. But already through tracing these debates, I think I can suggest the direction that's being taken away from the founding bargain and maybe even closer to the model Taylor himself had in mind of secularity as a response to democratic diversity. Certainly, that is not what secularity has meant in Turkey's Republican history, quite the opposite. But there is maybe some potential, and I'm happy to explore this in the Q&A, that it might come to mean something more akin to that at a time when you have multiple elites contesting for political power and engaging in a contestation of the bargain that produced the cultural politics of the founding. So I'll stop with that.
Great. So I have a question about Western influences or transnational influences and about Turkish exceptionalism that has three subparts or sub-questions. So the first sub-question is this, that you begin the paper with this observation that the Ottoman Empire and later the Turkish Republic were thoroughly marked by mutually constitutive encounters between the Middle East and West. And you began your comments now with a note that the larger project with which you were engaging this project had to do with contesting the idea that you could look at or develop a narrative of secularity, as Charles Taylor attempted to do, without respect to anything outside of Western Christendom. So while I know this is not the focus of the paper, can you say a little bit more about Ottoman and or Turkish influences that helped constitute Western notions of religion and secularism, and then whether this phenomenon, this mutually constitutive phenomenon of encounters between the Middle East and the West continue to this day, in what forms that manifests, and are there, beyond sort of Middle East and West, within the Middle East, are there areas of further encounter that are, by which Turkey is developing its notions of religion and secularism in the public sphere, and other states are doing likewise? So the second sub-question is about Turkish exceptionalism itself, or just the very notion of Turkish exceptionalism, which you draw out in the paper. And as I read it or understood in the paper, that falls along 3 lines. One is the Kemalist secularization as westernization or modernization program that arises out of a non-colonial or non-post-colonial context. The second, the Turkish version of secularism that you describe to us as neither like French laïcité, sort of total exclusion of religion, or Taylor's Secularity 1, and not like the American separation of church and state with its non-establishment free exercise, but it's something that closely controls the state production of religion, religious institutions. Maybe there's some, it fits best with Secularity 3 on his model. And then third, as you described, the Turkish model is wrapped up in particular events in Turkish recent history, particularly political and military, the military coups, 3 military coups and a 4th threatened judicial coup against political leaders who threatened the secular nature of the state. So on these grounds, if that's right, these are the things that make Turkey exceptional. How exceptional do they make Turkey? Is Turkey similar enough to other states that control and co-opt religion that we might draw lessons, positive or negative, from Turkey, or have something to say about the relationship between Turkey and other states in the larger Muslim world or elsewhere? And secondly, is to say that it's exceptional, to say that there are no parallels that may be drawn. So I guess the question is, what's the extent and significance of the exceptionalism claim? And the third sub-question is a simple one. Is Turkey, does it fit squarely within Charles Taylor's Secularity 3 definition, or is it a little bit different? Is there some Secularity 4 that it represents and you would like to add to the master narrative to make it truly a master narrative?
Let me start with the third and proceed up. So first of all, I think that I'm not invested in the production of master narratives, that's for sure. And I mean, there are numbers of different ways that one could engage in a critique. This particular project, the book project and the chapter, are just looking at these external to the story he's telling territories and asking what is lost in his account by virtue of failing to attend to them, basically. And so definitely I wouldn't say that. I think that Secularity 3 introduces an interesting account that's missing from much of the rest of the legal sociology on religion and secularism, and that's useful. It certainly isn't a perfect fit by any stretch, and it's not at all what he means. In fact, he would probably not recognize my use of his term in the Turkish context, because I'm saying, if you think of Secularity 3 as a shift in the conditions of belief, he describes it as an organic shift. I'm describing it as part of a social engineering project. That's not at all what he means. I'm just pointing out that to the extent that secularization entails this kind of shift in the conditions of belief, an epistemic shift, that's something that the state was very invested in producing in this particular context in a way that's not at all anticipated by Taylor. But I wouldn't call that a Secularity 4 or 5. I just think I'm not, I am not actually an intellectual historian for the most part, and the idea of doing taxonomies that are meant to either find sort of unicausal, monocausal world histories, or explain an idea as it has existed across 700 years and so forth, those are way beyond the scope of any project I can undertake. So, but I mean, I do think clearly there's no square fit between his idea, and I've just appropriated the insight and used it in this context and asked how much traction maybe I can get from it that just institutional differentiation doesn't get us. The second question, Turkish exceptionalism, again, every country's trajectory is obviously idiosyncratic. I don't want to overstate by any stretch what's exceptional about the Turkish case. I mean, the fact that it's a non-colonial encounter in the Middle East is interesting, right? But I mean, you could imagine Iranians making a semi-similar claim about their own constitutional trajectory and the difference between their relationship to Britain and so forth. I think that actually, though, if I were to try to look at similar cases, the one that I've always been most fascinated by and would very much like to do a comparative account of is the state formation stories of Turkey and Israel, as opposed to another Muslim country in the region, and the role of Zionism as a state formation ideology that's trying to produce a homogenous national identity and cultural practices and so forth, and appropriate religion in the service of the state, while at the same time making certain kinds of claims about either institutional differentiation or the capacity to sustain a liberal democratic project and so forth. So I definitely think that there are comparisons, plenty of comparisons to be had across many dimensions. Now, there are other ways in which you pointed to the contemporary moment of military political. So there's the state formation story, which is not that exceptional even in the region, and also, of course, is not exceptional at all in terms of the influences that are inputs into the Turkish process, because Turkey is being informed to the extent that you want to develop a Western model in the 1920s, it's probably going to look like a fascist model, because that's what the West looked like in the 1920s, to be frank. There are ideas of German sort of romanticism and national, or folk identity coupled with hyper modernism invested in a kind of positivist Enlightenment science, produced many really regrettable effects in Europe that are far exceed any of the damages that the Turkish project has produced, but it's completely continuous with. So it's not exceptional in the sense that these pathologies are exceptional to Turkey. It's just that the particular historical trajectory meant the encounter with the West is a different kind of encounter. But having said that, as you move forward to the contemporary period in the Republican history, clearly there's an intense interaction between Turkey and the Middle East as a region at the moment in the production of an alternative sort of local variant modern conception of political Islam. And Turkey understands itself to be an exporter at this point of its vision in a variety of ways, and that means that there's a tremendous amount that can be studied, at least. I think learned would be a little strong, but what it is that Turkey is investing itself in its relationship to the region, increasingly in a sectarian mode as a Sunni regional power, but also thinking of itself as a sort of, if you want, a kind of invested in a pedagogical project to moderate Muslim Brotherhood actors, particularly with respect to Syria, but equally in their relationships with Muslim Brotherhoods in Egypt and Jordan, Tunisia, Morocco, et cetera. All of that is an extremely interesting project to do. It's not a project I've undertaken, but the idea that this moment in Turkey is producing a particular set of contestations within Turkey needs to be placed in a much broader context. And I thought where you were going to go with your question, which is perfectly valid, right? And this is, I'm not claiming to produce a millennia-long intellectual history of an idea as it marched through time, and I'm only engaging in a very small case study here. But what you could definitely say by way of critique of me is my failure to attend to the contextual situation of Turkey. So if Taylor is guilty of restricting himself to Latin Christendom in a particular territory, of course I'm also guilty of restricting myself in a very similar way to a particular territory, to debates within one polity around these ideas.
That's the first question.
Well, it is situated in a book that is looking at all of these case studies, but to some extent, you're right to point out in isolation, and we will do some work ultimately to do framing chapters that will enable those case studies to be in conversation with one another. But when your exercise is 30 pages and not 900 pages, I think you can take some liberties in restricting the kinds of claims that you're trying to advance a little bit, but that's not much of an excuse. I mean, I think particularly in the contemporary period, and there are moments where I say, look, there's a reason why the state took this approach in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. There's a reason why the rise of political Islam in the rest of the region had particular implications from the perspective of Turkish state elites, but much, much more could be done to say how Turkey itself, the concepts were evolving in conversation with the Middle East, not just Europe, and also the extent to which that model was, the state was self-consciously, particularly in the last decade, seeking to export aspects of their own conception to the rest of the region. So on Ottoman Turkish influences, I'll just say briefly again, this isn't something that I am able to get into any detail in this paper, and it's not my principal area of study in 19th century and early 20th century history of sort of late Ottoman thought, but there is a lot that's been done on particularly the relationship to France and the relationship to Germany and German and French intellectual traditions, literary traditions, the emphasis in late Ottoman reforms, educational reforms for the military and organizational reforms for the military in getting training and engaging in exchanges with France in particular again. So it's not, and I try to suggest this, not coincidental that a Jacobin model was deemed very influential. Similarly, though, because of its geographic situation and because of the sort of incredible ripple effects of the Soviet Revolution, there's also a tremendous amount of influence in that period in the development of the actual Republican reformers of the Soviet models and state planning ideas and just ideas about the way in which a central state can actually produce a particular kind of polity and citizenry. So I can't trace that out here, but definitely it's an incredibly important story.
Wonderful. So let's open it up. I will take Stephen first, and if the others of you can keep your hands up, I will keep a queue. Stephen.
It's a wonderful effort. So I have two questions. One focuses on the comparison that you do make in the paper between Turkey and the West, and the idiosyncrasy of kind of a liberal version of secularization that takes place in Turkey. And the other is something that just alluded to by Intisar, which is a comparison one might want to make between Turkey and the Middle East in particular, and how idiosyncratic is it there. So with respect to the West, of course, the point here you're making is that the common pulling together of Turkey with France as examples of extreme secular state is unstable, because the Turkish model is idiosyncratic in the ways you point out. But it seems to me, and I haven't read Taylor's book, that in terms of the narrative of French secularization, there's a great deal in common between the two. That's to say, the secularization of France took place at the end of the Ancien regime. It was about modernization. It was creating a new French citizen out of the disparate regions, languages, cultures, religions, the religious wars in France. And so the secularization was very much a part of the attempt to create a homogenized French citizen from the disparity, the diversity that had taken place. So I see kind of the nation-building homogenization and the kind of revolutionary aspect of the secular state in France as something that's very common. To be sure, it took different forms, right? And it is a liberal versus an illiberal. But there's something deeply connecting to those two secularization movements, I think, I would say. In terms of the Turkey versus Middle East, in the very last session we had from Karen Still, she told us that the model for the Islamic establishment clauses was the Ottoman 1876 constitution. And so I'm wondering whether here too, the distinctive Turkish model of illiberal, authoritarian secular state, nation building, nationalization, was a common model for the secular nationalist states in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Egypt to some extent. So to what extent did they look to the Turkish Kemalist model achieving these same goals as the model of secularization, and also bringing it up to now, and this you did allude to what extent, are the Middle East transitional regimes looking to the contemporary situation in Turkey as an exemplar of this more accommodationist model of secularization, which you're arguing is competing conceptually with the original?
Great, thank you so much for those questions, Stephen. So one of my favorite books is Eugene Weber's Peasants into Frenchmen, which tells that story that you're describing, and absolutely is a comparable, I think, although as you point out, liberal as opposed to illiberal in the ways, again, there's no idea of the state actually producing Catholicism or intervening in an anti-clerical fashion to the point of actually replacing the clergy and so forth. But other than that, I agree with you completely, and I think that there's a strong illiberal stand in that kind of a social engineering project wherever it may take place, and however much it may allow some realm of autonomy for religion that is not adequately captured in the claims that, on my reading, that Taylor makes ultimately for the sources and purposes of secularity in the Western context. So yes, I completely agree with that. On the comparison with the Middle East, actually one thing that your question points out, and Intisar's question did as well, and I missed responding to this, is the degree to which the Turkish Republican project is not discontinuous at all with Ottoman approaches. So one thing that's worth noting is that the Ottomans came up with this diagnosis that these are the sources of problems, and sought to centralize and try to control the ulema and created a director of religious affairs model. And the Kemalists really are just inheritors of that reformist vision, but they're able to now try to impose it on a consolidated territory, not trying to manage a very heterogeneous empire, and also they do it in a much more ruthless fashion, following a war that has rendered much of the population sort of disoriented and to some extent homeless and so forth. I mean, they do it in a very different demographic sociological context, and it takes root in the 1920s in a way that it failed in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s through Tanzimat and the constitutional order. But that constitutional order and those reforms affected not just Turkey, because of course it was an empire, but all of the rest of the Middle East as well that remained within, and of course to greater and lesser degrees. So the degree of centralization that the empire could hope to have in influencing the exact trajectory of institutional development in Syria, for example, was not nearly as great as it would have been in the metropole, but it was still substantial. And it was substantial throughout the territories that were under Ottoman control. And so they experienced that constitution themselves, and they actually are inheritors of that constitutional tradition and experience, and also just more generally of the Tanzimat reforms. And so first of all, without even looking to the degree to which Kemalism or the Republicans and so forth were models, there is actually a shared legacy in the region of that 19th century reform effort that marks the ongoing projects, that then post-colonial projects of the states of the region. Beyond that, then in this particular moment, zooming forward to the 21st century, I wrote a piece that came out of another one of our meetings. Intisar also participates in that seminar series that she described in her introduction, that basically said, my argument was Turkey is not a model for the Arab uprisings. I mean, it was just an attempt to say, get away from this idea. This is a terrible, toxic idea because of this, what was required to get to this point, at least in the Turkish state formation legacy. I mean, things are path dependent. There are institutionalized histories here, et cetera. And so maybe there's something interesting from the perspective of Egyptians or Tunisians or whoever in this model, but they need to understand in some ways what it's embedded in. And that article was a response to not Western prescriptions, although there were plenty. I mean, and in the paper I also note the Beltway. I mean, it was a really interesting moment in 2011 because all through 2010, the refrain about Turkey was, it's turned to the east, it's lost, they're Islamists, they've lost the compass, and they're making a hash of their efforts, and the AKP is a real threat. To suddenly in 2011, it's a wonderful model, everyone should look to Turkey, let's embrace it, et cetera, in the Beltway. But what I was really reacting to was the emergence of parties that self-consciously describe themselves as justice and development parties, embraced the label, and insisted that in an attempt to quell anxieties in their own societies, we are going to be moderate Islam. I mean, after a decade of people in Turkey trying to basically challenge this idea of moderation and moderate Islam and so forth as a particularly insidious kind of project, not as an indictment of the AKP or suggesting that they're somehow immoderate, but just the whole analytic lens of seeking moderation and speaking of that as a normative goal as being preposterous. Suddenly, all these actors throughout the rest of the region are embracing it, wanting absolutely to champion it and so forth, without necessarily attending to some of the baggage that would come along with those labels, those set of concepts, and the institutional form that the relationship, for example, between civilian and military governance in Turkey has taken. So that article was an intervention that precisely I felt the need to make because I think there is a strong tendency at the moment. I think it's abated to some extent, and some of it, I mean, many of you in this room will have a keener sense of the most recent iterations of these kinds of arguments, but some of it has risen and fallen on the personal popularity of Erdogan, which again is absolutely just a kind of diversionary and irritating fact about his larger-than-life persona in the way that he happens to project it both domestically, where he's a very charismatic, personally very charismatic leader, but regionally by manipulating particular moments and windows of opportunity to burnish his image in a particular way, but that sort of obscures what's happening underlying that image within Turkey itself, including things like the unbelievably authoritarian internal structures of the political party that he presides over, which are generating forms of repression within the, let's call it, pro-Islamic sector in Turkey that are really stultifying of political development within Turkey as a consequence of that charisma. So in any case, that intervention was an attempt to say, yes, these kinds of arguments are being heard, and I think that there are intrinsic dangers and risks in pursuing a Turkish model without attending to the history from which it emerged.
The gentleman in the back.
As a non-specialist, I'm especially fascinated by the window on Turkey, which contradicts the kind of too simplistic notion of Turkish secularism as something much more analogous to America's wall of separation between church and state, provides a much more nuanced and historically specific notion of the way in which, for example, religion is used by the state as a tool. And I just want to shift gears a little bit away from the cross-national comparisons to more sort of within Turkey comparisons. Because one of the things that struck me as I read your paper was the Kemalist willingness to essentially put all of his chips on the core and to say the periphery will take care of itself. The backward regions of Turkey, Anatolia, and the like will trickle down, the center says, and so we don't really have to worry about backwardness in the provinces because the the attractiveness of the modern will eventually sort of percolate out. And that struck me as a really very powerful sort of mistake, okay, on the part of the Kemalist, because at least as I read your paper, what you're arguing is that the ability of the periphery to essentially penetrate the center was dramatically understated and emphasized by the attempts of the center to use the periphery to control the periphery, thus introducing elements of peripheral elites into the center. So that was sort of one general observation I'd like to kind of get you to react to. And then the other general observation I had, again, about within Turkey politics, was the very strong importance that you attach to education. Because it was very clear from, at least to me, as I read your paper, that you were really talking about the fight over education. And that does resonate, for example, with homeschooling in the United States and issues like that that have to do with, again, give me control of the child till he is 6, is it? Is that the Jesuit line? And, you know, he is mine or she is mine for life. So if you could just talk a little bit about the core periphery issues, maybe more, and sort of whether you see these as mistakes by the Kemalists, and also perhaps where you see the struggle for education going in the contemporary setting.
So I think I would be, again, wary of saying something is a mistake by Kemalists or not. I mean, I'm, you know, as you might glean from this paper, I would not describe myself personally as a Kemalist, and I'm not committed to that ideological project, while at the same time I understand that myself and anyone else who's a product of any aspect of the Turkish educational system or just Turkish nationality is marked directly by that project and are themselves products of the project, and so can't also gain the distance from it, et cetera. I mean, I have to acknowledge that we are inheritors of what that project has wrought, for better or worse, in a variety of ways, and some of those have been very salutary effects. But these weren't, you know, one can't now sort of project backwards and attribute motivation and logics and so forth to those reformers, and their goal was simply securing the foundations and institutionally of a state with the resources that were available, and that meant they didn't deliberately completely exclude the periphery. They did invest in education and literacy campaigns and all kinds of things that were intended to draw the periphery in, but they really were interested in making sure that they had clear ideological, cultural, and economic control of what they understood to be the engines, the dynamos of the country. And that was related to a particular understanding of state building at the time, influenced by the Soviet model and so forth, that, I mean, to call it mistaken is just, again, I feel like it would be anachronistic to make that claim. Having said that, what their actual policies produced was the drawing of the periphery to the center, and they intended that. They just imagined, as you just said, that the redemptive mission of modernization and so forth would necessarily be so seductive that that periphery would immediately become invested in the project. That was a mistaken understanding, for a variety of reasons, including the just demographic fact of the country. So when you ended up having that periphery come to, I mean, just urbanization as it took place throughout the global South had a similar effect. It generated these kinds of peripheries within around urban centers that then had their own socio-political formations, had their own identity characteristics, had their own counter logics and so forth. And that was something they didn't obviously anticipate because of their understanding of the compelling nature of the state's project and its necessary momentum. So I agree with you that there was a limited vision, but I mean, to call it a mistake, I think would be overly strong. And by the way, the core periphery question is has been a central agenda item for anybody doing political science or sociology of Turkey since at least the late 1960s, early 1970s, with path-breaking and incredible work by people. So this is by no means my insight or my argument. I mean, this is something that absolutely characterizes the study of the trajectory of the Turkish Republic, and the significance of that core periphery divide has been something that has, for every decade since the 60s, been at the center of study of the country politically. The second question, the trajectory of education, so this most recent initiative. Now, I should, by the way, step back and say, what I've provided here is a kind of account of the highest order state level vision of what education is going to be, and nothing at all like an ethnography of what the outcomes are of these educational projects or the experience, or even really a detailed political economy of what's happening. I'm not capable of offering that. I'm very interested in those questions, and others are doing some of that work. But particularly, for example, I note that one of the facts about this new reform is that you have now 4-year compulsory unified education and then 12 years of compulsory education, but there's this bifurcation in the content. All of the content is controlled by the state. So one question I'm very interested in that I don't fully know the answer to is these additional resources that flow into the Imam Hatip sector that make them better funded and better resourced schools, what exactly is being produced there? What is the political economy of that? Where are the flows coming from? I have a sense of that, and there's been a lot of work on the Anatolian Tigers and the Gülen movement and others, and the ways in which they've come up with this kind of pyramid mechanisms for the distribution of money. But in any case, what exactly are those resources employed for? They're not employed to alter the curriculum because that's not permitted. So although they can be employed to offer private Quranic courses and other kinds of things in an after-school context, they can also be employed to offer much better facilities, scholarship opportunities, bring students from villages to more central towns. I mean, there are numbers of things that they can work towards, but exactly how that money translates, what that means on the ground, any kind of fine-grained analysis of that, I'm not in a position to answer, and those are very important questions to understanding this trajectory. Having said that, what I describe are the fears at the policy level that people have of what it means when those latter 8 years are available for religious vocational education, even though most of those graduates are seeking academic degrees thereafter, going to university and not going into the clergy. Nonetheless, they are being formed. I mean, the state formation pedagogical project is an ongoing project, but what is being formed now is, again, memorably, as Erdogan claimed, a religious generation, and there are tremendous anxieties about what that means. What it means at base, though, is the same exact mechanisms are being deployed by a different elite with a different vision about what they hope the pedagogy of the state will produce. It's not a different political project, and therefore it's not a more suspect one. You or I or any one of us might have greater cultural affinity to one set of goals than the other set of goals, but the idea and the channeling of resources is the same. And that's one of the great ironies of the success of the Kemalist project, returning to the very beginning point of my response, is that all of these are legacy Kemalist initiatives. They're not distinct from, and indeed all of those are very much inheritors of the late Ottoman model. So this crisis of empire produced a set of answers or a set of logics about diagnoses about how best to proceed that continue to have these quite path-dependent results, even when in the hands of allegedly Islamist actors.
Next on the queue is Ellen.
So I enjoyed this paper a lot, and I think that it's interesting, of course, it's got a very elite perspective, right? And this is an elite project, and these are sort of the crisis to be solved, and it's solved at a very elite level. And I'm wondering how much, we talked a little bit at the outset about, sort of thinking about what's the effect of sort of other areas on Turkey, but also how much is this a time-bound story, right? So if we really sort of take basically 20, 30, and 40 Turkey, right? And now we're saying, you almost have the story starting over. You're saying, okay, now we're moving into a point where these debates are being opened, the elites are renegotiating, et cetera. How much needs to be thought about what's changed in the last, nearly 100 years in terms of who's engaging in these debates, and not only is it no longer just elites, but to what extent has globalization on the one side, sort of technological urbanization, those kinds of changes, how much has that really changed whose voices are heard, and how much does that become democratized as a debate, right? And if that's the case, then do we need to rethink what does the 20s tell us about 2000 and whatever we're in. So that's the first question I have, and the second one is just sort of a comment, which is that your reading, at least my reading of your reading of the Kemalist vision and that debate almost seems very sanguine. You know, they saw this as the solution and took it. It doesn't seem nearly as bloody and repressive and sort of a hotly contested struggle as I understand at least it was. Which brings us again to this question of what, you know, how do we then sort of read the sort of the upcoming struggle, and how much of that, the fact that it's a hotly contested struggle, lead us to an idea that it should therefore have a different type of outcome. Okay,
great. So let me start again with the second and then go to the first. So the sanguine, I mean, again, it's like a incredibly bird's eye, abstract set of accounts of this sort of conceptual train. I agree with you completely. I try to give a better sense of that in that other article that I sort of piggyback this one on that says a little bit more about what those debates actually look like. And then, of course, evacuated from this whole story is any account of the deep social cleavages that characterize the founding of the Republic, particularly around the Kurds and the ongoing Kurdish communities questions and issues. And so this looks at a very narrow slice of some of these debates that were going on and doesn't really also address the way in which the early decade of the Republic was characterized by debates about different, you know, more, let's say, pluralist vision, and then this more totalizing vision that prevails. But that's definitely true, that history exists, and I mean, maybe I should signal it better in footnotes, but again, this chapter is not going to encompass that, but that's absolutely true. What it tells us about today, and also these other, so I lump under all of the kinds of changes that you just pointed to, all of which are incredibly important, from globalization to, you know, the effects of urbanization, to the sort of digital revolution, to the emergence of the capacity of autonomous civil society actors to gain podia for themselves in a variety of ways, not just locally but transnationally, are incredibly important elements of the transformation that all countries are going through, the entire international order is going through, but certainly that's affecting Turkey. Just one quick example, again, that has nothing to do with this project, but is just characteristic of the degree to which this is the case. Many think, oh, the AKP has been great on Kurdish policy as compared to earlier, I mean, it's terrible, but as compared to earlier governments, it's better, you know, Kurdish language can be taught and so forth. The AKP enters at a time when the Turkish state had already acknowledged that the rise of satellite media has meant not only that all of their restrictions are fully bypassed by Germany, Denmark, I mean, and they fought a losing battle in the 1990s to get things shut down in this place and that place and failed over and over again, but it's also produced something completely different and interesting, which is a Kurdish lingua franca that all Kurdish communities, whether they're in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, or Syria, can now understand, a kind of Egyptian dialect, if you want, of Kurdish that also produces all kinds of new possibilities for political coalition building and just mutual understanding and recognition and so forth that are novel. I mean, that are literally a product of the development of satellite media and the Kurdish diaspora in Europe and so forth, all of which completely escape any account that just grounds itself in the 1930s and how the Turkish state formulated its policies towards a local Kurdish population without thinking about the sort of transnational diaspora and so on. But anyway, that's just one small example of the thing. But I try to capture all of that by saying, look, here are the demographic changes broadly that the Republic has experienced in this more recent period that undergird these debates. And so while I'm talking about elite debates, there's no question about that at the political party level and so forth, who can have access to the category elite is totally transformed, right? I mean, what we're talking about in the 20s and 30s is, you know, 100,000 people, if that, intermarried families from, you know, that have various connections to Ottoman legacy and are located in two major cities. Basically, that was three cities, let's say. I mean, the evolving Ankara, I'm not really counting it, but Istanbul and Izmir. I mean, that's basically what was driving. That is the origin point. And most of even those elites didn't come from those cities originally, but had ended up in those cities after they were purged from the Balkans. I mean, it's a totally different demographic makeup, incredibly insular, coming out of very similar educational backgrounds and so on. And I make this point when I talk about the AKP. In my lifetime, every prime minister and president of Turkey prior to Erdogan was a graduate of the same university as my father, literally. Istanbul Technical University had produced all, I mean, there are lots of other universities that have contributed to many, many characters, but you have had a tremendous dominance of a particular set of institutions, a particular formation, a particular class and social background, et cetera. The way I try to capture the transformation is by noting that what the AKP does is totally pluralize who gets access to that high-level political elite. It's still an elite story, but it's a story in which the elite is now comprised of an Imam Hatip graduate as prime minister and as the most important charismatic leader that is characterizing the Turkish political landscape for over a decade, and the first person really to have been able to consolidate civilian rule against military authority. And so obviously it remains an elite story, but it's an elite story that itself is internally transformed, maybe in ways that I need to signpost much more clearly in this chapter, which, by the way, I should have noted at the outset, this is a very preliminary draft that I accelerated the production of for this purpose, but that needs to go through many more rounds of refining. And so it's very helpful to hear that I may not be capturing that. And anyway, it's flattening. I mean, it's a very one-dimensional way to try to capture it, to claim, well, there have been these demographic changes, and let's look at, the consequence of, a set of political economy changes and urbanization, and take that as a sufficient proxy for what those changes look like. And maybe it's not.
Can I just really quickly, that actually might be the way to capture it, and I'm not sure that an alternative is necessary. But just what strikes me is I think there is a real question about whether all that's changing is that now you have new preferences being able to be sort of, kind of represented, if you will, within these debates, or if there's something even more fundamentally different about debates when you have a lot more points of access and a lot more different ways to get into it. And I don't know the answer to that. I just think it's worth thinking about whether or not there's more fundamental changes going on than just one about who are the players at the table, essentially, which is what you're suggesting is the change. So, I don't know. Think about it. Then let me know.
Okay.
Shada.
Yes. Going back to the first question on Turkey not being a model for the rest of the Middle East, just wanted to know if this has always been the case, or was Turkey also not a model in late 19th century, early 20th century for the rest of the Middle East? If it has not been a model in 19th century, what is creating this ongoing impression? And if it has been a model, what is creating this impression? And if it has not, does this suggest that those movements were grassroots? Also, I would appreciate it if you could please give us the title to the piece that you have argued. You mentioned it was that you've written about this on us.
It's
That's in
yeah,
the paper.
it's one of the footnotes in the paper. What is it?
The
Perils
perils
of judicial independence. There was a lot of back and forth about what that was, whether it was going to be perils or paradox or blah blah. But in any case, it's from this past year in the Virginia Journal of International Law, and it's one of the early footnotes, I think.
And it's available online.
Yeah. Sorry, and just to clarify, when you say were these movements grassroots, which movements do you mean by that?
Let's say modernizing or
The Turkish movements, not the.
No, in the rest of the Middle East.
Oh, I see.
Turkey was not a model in late 19th century and early 20th century. Does this suggest that these were completely grassroots, or were they borrowing from somewhere else?
And this is against the backdrop of Iran's constitutional experiment around the same time, and perhaps others.
Okay. So in the 19th century, I think it would be hard to speak of Turkey as a model so much as just a giant behemoth actor in the region that was having, the choices of the empire, however weakened it had become, were nonetheless having real implications for the remainder of the region. Now, this is obviously less true for those parts of the region that were not part of the empire, either still centrally part of the empire or in the case of Egypt, still influenced by aspects of the empire, even despite some degree of autonomy. So Iran is distinctive in this respect. But for the rest of the region, it would be hard to talk about it as a model as opposed to just the backdrop against which they themselves were struggling to articulate a form of independence, and that Arab nationalism was developing, with the Ottomans as the foil against which that autonomous identity was being defined. With respect to the movements in the region, I think there are just many origins, most of which have to do with these same sets of encounters, but not necessarily refracted through the Ottoman lens in all cases. So again, Iran's trajectory, for example, may have been influenced at various moments in the 20th century by Iran's own interpretation of what the accomplishments had been of the Kemalist project in the state formation period. But that isn't to say that necessarily anyone in Iran saw Turkey as a model. And indeed, I think there was no talk of Turkey as a model for the region in most of the 20th century. I don't think anybody thought the alien empire represented a model for anybody. They saw it as something that they could potentially gain autonomy from by engaging in strategic alliances at best. And then from the 1920s until basically the turn of the century, it was seen as a kind of turning away from the region that represented a repudiation and a break that was equally met with a very sort of negative historical retelling of what the Ottoman experience had been in the region. So you have these competing narratives in the 20th century being produced by Turkish scholars about a backward Middle East that engaged in betrayals and allied with the British and destroyed the empire, and their forms of nationalism were kind of, you know, pathological attack on the empire. And at the same time, you have, you know, histories being produced in the Arab world through the Arab nationalist lens of the Turkish period as like the new Jahiliya, a period of ignorance and backwardness, a kind of dark ages for the Arab world. And so I don't think you had a 20th century phenomenon of modeling on any kind of a Turkish basis. But what changes then is the rise of the AKP, the rise of a particular kind of model of political party that existed previously and had ties. So throughout the 1990s, I try to suggest what the political party trajectory looked like. It began in basically 1968 with the creation of the first of the sort of proto-Islamist political parties, and then continued, and the AKP is just the most recent successor of that legacy. And throughout that period, various leaders in Turkey were reaching out to the Arab world, but they weren't having great success. And their idea that they wanted to reintegrate with a kind of Islamic past, if you want, wasn't something that was either being seen as a model in Turkey or in the places that they identified as with the Islamic past. So there was nothing appealing about it. That appeal is new, and I don't think it has anything to do with whether or not alternative visions of modernization in the region were grassroots or not grassroots, authentic or not authentic. It has to do with a particular window of opportunity and political convergence of interests in the region today that make Turkey a kind of interesting new regional actor that different, you know, parties within the region want to align themselves with.
Aisha.
Thank you, Asli, for this. I especially like you know, the way that you address it, you know, from the angle of the headscarf issue and public education, because it reveals a lot. These are the two critical issues. My question is again about the change. So you know, maybe following up on that one. Let me put it this way. There is the Directorate of Religious Affairs, you know, which was founded 1924 with the evolution of the Caliphate. It is through the directorate that, you know, the state basically controls religious education. And whenever I mention this, you know, people think the state controls religious education in order to spread religion, which is really not the case. In order to monopolize, you know, actually that is the purpose of that. In order to make sure that no one else is teaching, you know, religion, but state is doing it and state is controlling, which has been the, you know, distinguishing feature of Turkish secularism anyway. So in a way, my question is this. Well, the early Republican elite clearly had what Sherif Mardin had called a distaste for religion, right? Now, given the fact that the new elite do not have that distaste for religion, you know, to put the least, I think, do you anticipate a change in the role of the Directorate of Religious Affairs, you know, rather than, you know, controlling it? I mean, is there a shift? Are there signs of that shift?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's very interesting. So if you want to put any credence in my claim, accidental Democrats, accidental liberalizers, here's where the rubber meets the road at some level, right? This was a party, and these were actors that were great critics of the Directorate of Religious Affairs because of the stranglehold that it had on the production of religious knowledge and education, and on the clergy and so forth, and of the approach of the state to religion in generally. And now that they control the levers of power, they're very happy with the same institutions, because now they're in a position, first of all, to shift the makeup of the civil service that comprises that directorate, and secondly, to influence the content of what gets produced. Now, I think their goal is still the same Kemalist goal, and this is what I was saying are the kind of ironies of the project, which is to exercise control over what gets produced as Orthodox Sunni Hanafi interpretations, and also to limit the exposure of the public to other heterodox ideas of Islam. So, for example, the AKP has characteristically been very open to incorporating Christianity and Judaism and other non-Muslim worldviews in a variety of ways, and been quite ecumenical in its approach to religious endowments and enabling Christian and Jewish minority communities in Turkey to reaccess their own properties, reopen educational institutions, et cetera. By contrast, the fight that the Alevi community, a heterodox Muslim community in Turkey, has had to fight against these AKP-controlled institutions to get even the slightest margin of autonomy has been astonishing, and it has been much greater. I mean, the degree of repression that they experience has been much greater under the AKP than under previous times, in part because the Alevi community felt aligned with the projects of the state previously, and now feel that they are in tension with the projects of this particular government, and so they really want to make sure that they have this amount of autonomy. There's one long footnote where I describe the battle through the European Court of Human Rights that they've had to wage just to get any level of recognition. And even so, for example, the Director of Religious Affairs refuses to acknowledge their places of worship as institutions that are deserving of state support, unlike all other mosques unlike all mosques, jamive are not being recognized and so forth. So I mean, there are a number of ways in which you can see the AKP using the levers in exactly the same way. Now, when I say exactly the same way, what I mean is they're interested in the production of what counts as state-sanctioned Orthodox Islam that is consonant with their own political projects, just as the Kemalists were interested in that. It has very different implications if you're an Alevi Turk facing that same directorate, but the underlying goal, which is to translate political power into the manufacturing of a kind of curriculum that produces particular private religious identities, remains the same. And I think it's worrying. It's extremely worrying. It undercuts my claim that they have any prospect for being accidental liberalizers, beyond the fact that they've pluralized the political spectrum and access to these levers. Once they actually control them, they seem to behave in exactly the same way as their previous opponents.
So I'll give it over to Sujit, but also take the opportunity to see if there are other questions and ask you to keep your hands up for a minute.
There's a hand.
Okay. So let me. So this is a terrific paper, and so what I wanted to engage with is a bit about the method, right? So it's largely kind of it's sort of in the tradition of or in the mode of political sociology, and kind of institutions come in and out. Mm-hmm. And so what's of course so fascinating about the Turkish constitutional experience for scholars of comparative constitutional politics and constitutional design is how this battle over the architecture of the relationship between state and society around the question of religion has been constitutionalized, and there's sort of a technology around this. And then these battles have been fought out in the Turkish Constitutional Court, right? And we know you've written about this. And so what I wanted to, the way in which that the received kind of way in which that those issues have been presented has been the idea that the Kemalist elite hardwired the Constitution and used its control over the judiciary, and particularly appointments to the TCC prior to 2010, in a sense to entrench its preferences and sort of to hedge itself against whether these parties that were going to challenge this, and particularly the AKP and its predecessors, Refah and so on. And so what I found interesting in the paper is that you kind of complicate that story in two ways, and I wanted to invite you to elaborate upon that. So the first was, this idea of what you call the Turkish model of secularity, where the state produces this Sunni identity through kind of religious education, creates an institutional space for counter-mobilization within the legal, that's created by law. And so it's almost as if the system itself kind of created an opening for counter-mobilization in a way that might have been kind of unintended. Okay? And so I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate on that point. The second point has to do with the role of European institutions, right? So there's this whole, there's a very, as you know, there's been this, as part of the accession process, the Commission and in reliance on the Venice Commission has, in a sense, liberalized Turkish political space. And there's been this very kind of odd convergence between sort of a European human rights and democratization agenda and the AKP. And the AKP has almost kind of mobilized or utilized it to kind of reopen a number of aspects of the kind of the Turkish constitutional bargain, particularly on these issues. At least that's my read on it. So I'm wondering if you could kind of elaborate on that to kind of add a bit more kind of institutional texture to this story.
Okay, so the first part of that question, which is this kind of space for counter-mobilization, I take it that you mean that that state is in that space is created by either the contestation that might exist within the Directorate, for example, of Religious Affairs, over the production of the curriculum. And
That's
also,
right. Yeah.
by the way, just so you know, every sermon in Turkey is also written by this Directorate, and there's like a spectrum of different sermons you can choose amongst for any given Friday, but you are restricted to those that are approved by the Directorate of Religious Affairs. Every, of course, imam is appointed through this Directorate. Every mosque that's constructed has to be approved by this Directorate, and so forth. So, I mean, the degree of control that we're talking about and the idea, the level of centralization is something that I mean, of course, they didn't retain an ulema, but if they had, I mean, it would have been unheard of, totally undreamed of to have this level of monopolistic control. I think what they did in the first period, I mean, so to the extent that this has created a space of counter-mobilization, it's absolutely unintended. It would be like saying the Turkish Constitutional Court is such a space, because like the Turkish Constitutional Court, they controlled appointments in such a way as to absolutely, everything was subjected to a very strict ideological litmus test. And so it is the composition of the civil service that man these places, or in the case of the Constitutional Court, the judiciary, that determines the content of what can be produced. And that was kept under very strict controls. What, of course, wasn't anticipated to escape their control was sort of a decade-long governance by political Islamists that would have enough time to actually alter the demographic makeup of that civil service. And I mean, to some extent that had already begun to happen just by virtue of demographic change in Turkey itself, as again, through the 80s. I mean, so Özal was really the original period in which you had reforms introduced that began to alter the face of the civil service and began to internalize sort of the periphery, because new wealth was being generated, educational means had become better. You weren't just talking about a periphery that was present through the gecekondu shanty towns of the cities, but rather were generating, you know, substantial sort of educational attainment and human capital investment in the provincial capitals themselves. But in any case, so the two things that maybe were unanticipated was the degree to which rapid demographic change associated with economic liberalization might alter the complexion of the civil service, but much more directly what the consequence would be of this kind of a decade that no one would have anticipated of AKP rule, I think. Once you lose control of the makeup, composition, ideological litmus test, then you really have generated a space for counter-mobilization that I think is truly unintended and also very interesting, again, and deeply Kemalist. I mean, I keep coming back to this. This opposition is not an I mean, they might call themselves that, but what they really are is an opposition in the model of Kemalism itself with its many authoritarian strains, which is another reason why speaking of this as political Islam, of moderate Islamists and so forth, is to miss a kind of bigger picture of the institutional context out of which they were formed, and that they are themselves most comfortable navigating. And they have fallen into the role that their Kemalist predecessors played very easily, simply replacing one set of agendas with another. And I mean, this is obviously that is a simplified version of the story, but I think that is, I mean, sort of the account. So you still have the same level of institutional path dependence, and what's changed is the capacity of different actors to access those institutions, but deploying them in precisely the same ways. So that's the first part. The role of EU institutions is an absolutely fascinating question, because they have, for members of and again, these are incredibly crude shorthands, but I'm just going to say for contemporary members of the sort of Kemalist elite, westernized, urban, upper middle classes in the main cities, and again, gross oversimplification, I concede that immediately. But there was a trend already present in the 90s that has really accelerated of viewing the EU as a kind of Trojan horse through which these kind of useful idiots have allowed the AKP to gain power, and it's going to end up being the dismantling of all of the cultural accomplishments and socio-political accomplishments of the Kemalist project, which was intended to westernize. So the most westernized elites have become extremely skeptical of the EU process, ironically, and it's kind of hard to translate at times why it is that the most westernized sectors of the population are least enthusiastic about the European Union, even though they themselves view themselves as Europeans. So that is an interesting phenomenon that is a consequence of this belief that the EU and the AKPs, as a result of a kind of interest convergence story, have ended up collaborating in a way that has enabled the AKP to advance its agendas domestically. But I think there's another aspect of the story that's very interesting, which is if you look at the European Court of Human Rights, you'll find that Turkey is the state that is found against most often, with Russia sort of competing neck and neck since Russia joined. the convention. But if you look at the actual pattern of those cases, though, what you'll find is that Turkey is always losing on Kurdish questions, on all kinds of other questions related to political freedom, freedom of association, et cetera, except the questions that relate to secularism. The place where the Kemalist vision is systematically vindicated in Europe is on this question. And this represents an actual constraint on the AKP project at some level, to the extent that they have, and indeed, it was convenient for them as a result. It's not their doing, it wasn't anything that they fully controlled, that the EU accession process ground to a halt in 2005. It ground to a halt in 2005 as a result of the failure of the European constitutional project and the rise to power of people like Nicolas Sarkozy and Angela Merkel, who were opposed to Turkish accession. However, it came at a moment which meant that the AKP could excuse itself after having accomplished a set of liberalizing political reforms around penal code reform and so forth, from having to sort of deal with the European Union's deep suspicions about political Islam, and they're quite deep. So wherever, for example, the constitutional closure of the Refah Party, and after the Fazilet Party, these were ratified and vindicated by the European Court of Human Rights. The headscarf ban, absolutely, once again, vindicated by the European Court of Human Rights. So the departure of visions on liberalization here is substantial and actually tracks, in my view, the ways in which Kemalism does pick up on a westernization project. It has internalized a particular set of Western tropes about not only the appropriate place of religion, but the particular kind of threat posed by Islam internally in Turkey that is echoed back by the vision, so-called liberal, political liberal vision that the European court has of, again, the same question. So there's some interesting work that's been done by others on other places where the European Court has faced questions about religious freedom and how it has distinguished, for example, as Taylor does, interestingly, between Orthodox Christianity, which is treated as something that needs to be managed and controlled, and Latin Christendom, Catholic and Protestant traditions, where religious freedom is almost always vindicated at the expense of efforts by the state to control in some way expressions of religious freedom in those parts of Europe that are characterized by Catholicism and Protestantism.
Just could I comment on that? But I think the European Court, to be fair, I mean, I think that it legitimizes these policies by upholding them, but it doesn't mandate them, right? So,
but it doesn't, in other words, wherever the Turkish state acts illiberally, the European Court has historically, in fact, there are no other cases, I think, that Turkey ever has prevailed in,
it wins
other
in
than
cases, just
exclusively in these cases.
The headscarf,
so the headscarf cases and the party closure. Not party closure.
For Refah.
For Refah,
not
exactly.
For the communists, not for the
not
Kurds.
for the communists, not for the Kurds, exactly. So the political liberal vision parts company from the AKP vision on this particular set of questions. I'm not saying, although it is true that you've seen very similar trends in Germany, France, and England with respect to their internal debates, but I'm not saying the European Court is mandating this. I'm just saying there is a limit to the way that political liberalism translates into rights enhancement that the AKP is quite conscious of, I think. And so the stalling of the process may not have been, I mean, again, it's not their doing, but it may not have been adverse to their interests either in 2005, 2006.
Yeah.
So I know very little about Turkey, so I'm a little bit curious. You know, my vision of kind of the secularist Islamist divide in a lot of other, especially Arab countries, is that in many ways it tracks a kind of class or socioeconomic set of conflicts, and can be characterized, I think is often characterized, especially within the region, as anti-imperialist versus neoliberal capitalist kind of conflict. And I think you specifically see that highlighted around issues with the IMF and the World Bank, like Ben Ali's Tunisia being kind of very tied to the World Bank, that sort of thing. Jordan right now, they're kind of secularist elite being trying to please the IMF, that sort of thing. It doesn't sound like that's kind of what's happening in Turkey, but it does sound like there's a strong class dimension, at least you describe this as an elitist conflict, but at the same time there is sort of an idea of opening up to different socioeconomic classes that have been excluded from the political process before. So it doesn't sound like there's this sense of kind of anti-Western imperialism and it conflating Western values with certain economic policies, but it is interesting that we're still seeing kind of Islamist versus secularist kind of divide, and how do you see that tracking at all with what's going on in other countries along kind of the class dimension? Was that clear?
Yeah, it was. So I think it's a complicated story. To start with, Islamist political actors in Turkey are associated with these phrases like Islamist Calvinists, Islamic Calvinists, or Anatolian tigers, et cetera, which is to say that they embrace very strongly neoliberal policies and believe that their constituencies have benefited from the liberalization of the economy. Now, this is in part because of the form that the controlled economy took, which is heavy investment in industrialization in the western parts of the country to the exclusion of agricultural investment and forcing urbanization as a result because the job generation mechanisms were all located in those industrialization projects and dislocating and disrupting traditional sectors, but also meaning that a certain kind of private sector by neglect, if nothing else, had emerged in the provinces that wasn't dependent on state resources and wasn't dependent on access to state levers of power. And so when you had economic liberalization, the breakup of those big industrial concerns, that negatively impacted the traditional state elites that had benefited from privileged access to those resources. And conversely, those who had already generated a kind of small level petty bourgeoisie private sector in the Anatolian provinces thrived because they were quite accustomed to not benefiting from state support and subsidies and so forth. And so you had, over the course of 20 years, the emergence of a thriving sort of small to medium-sized industry sector in the Anatolian provinces that were very committed to ongoing economic liberalization. Now, this has set aside a number of other developments around corruption, and again, corruption was a long-standing problem, the differential access to state resources based on networks of who you knew and so forth, but who you know has now changed and shifted. And so you also have, you have the kind of confluence of benefiting from economic liberalization and also benefiting today from differential access to state resources because of the changing face and makeup and composition of the state. That's what's happening in Turkey. It definitely has a substantial class dimension, as I tried to highlight, that is the consequence of these kinds of policies and the ways in which they affected the political economy of the country during the state control period and afterwards. But it distinguishes it from the sort of the strategies, political economy strategies of the authoritarian states of the Arab world that channeled corruption in very different ways, and those elites that benefited from the corruption and the kind of state investment in those places are being displaced through a different trajectory, I think, at the moment in the Arab world. And so you do have, as you suggested, Muslim brotherhoods that aren't necessarily saying, we're the neoliberal alternative. We embrace, economic liberalization, but describing their goals and their constituencies' goals in very different ways because of just a different developmental history of what the political economy of authoritarianism looked like in places like Egypt, for example. So you have that discontinuity. On the other hand, you have the AKP in its imagined big brother role for Muslim brotherhoods actually trying to advocate this Islamic Calvinist model and suggesting to Muslim brotherhoods that they should embrace this idea that their constituencies will benefit from a more competitive economy and to break up state monopolies and to break up, access to subsidies through the state and so forth. And I'm not a political economist and I haven't followed what those relationships look like. But so I agree with your underlying assessment that there's a, first of all, sort of similarity in the broad picture of socioeconomic class differentiation between these actors historically. I think the particular trajectory in Turkey has meant that oddly enough, that a similar composition of, secular elite versus Islamist periphery, if you want, in the 50s, has produced an extremely different outcome now, where that periphery deems itself to be actually the sort of trailblazer with respect to economic liberalization and neoliberal embrace, in a way that's just a contrast with the rest of the Arab world as a result of their developmental patterns.
Other questions? Students? I'll start with one student question. I forgot who this was, but someone wrote about, or they were wondering about what other flashpoints other than the headscarf debate and the control over education issue you might point to. Are these the only ones, the main ones? Are there others, like the last question of economy, or like other contexts that we looked at, judicial review of issues relating to religion outside of headscarf or education debates? Do you have a sense of sort of the map?
So, and there are so many people in this room, and I feel a little embarrassed by sitting here as an authority on the broader map, beyond the four corners of my own paper, because there are multiple, I can see around the room, experts on Turkey in this room. But I will take a stab at answering that by saying, so these I think are the core, what I was interested in looking at by virtue of my own training is those debates that translate into constitutional or legal battles of some kind particularly, I mean, there are two locuses that I look at here, the courts and also the civil service and this sort of Directorate of Religious Affairs, and how the administrative regulatory regime intersects with the questions of religion. And I think these two debates are the critical ones with respect to that. But the rise of the AKP has generated a kind of cultural tidal shift that has opened up a whole set of other debates that are now, all of them, flashpoints. I mean, first of all, as I've already suggested, the Kurdish question, which is totally outside of this paper, but is a locus of great crisis, and in fact is going through, at the moment, a substantial transformation. Whether or not it'll be durable is a separate question. But, you know, the AKP took a very specific line, as opposed to Kemalist elites, on the Kurdish question, which I've characterized elsewhere as, you know, our Kurds and other Kurds, bad Kurds, or what have you, where the willingness to embrace a brotherhood platform of common Muslim identity and come within the very big tent that the AKP has set up of a huge center-right party that has all kinds of ideological variation within it, those Kurds that were prepared to participate in that project were embraced and could become the sort of, you know, the tip of the spear of getting at moving forward on the Kurdish question, if you want. Those Kurds that remained outside of that model and chose to have their own political party formation in the form of the BDP currently, and engaged in civil society activism outside of that model, and persistently remained on the left, I mean, a whole host of things, were not just treated as, out beyond the pale, but suffered a kind of crackdown that exceeds, in my view, anything that had been done previously under previous governments in terms of direct repression of civil society activism and the imprisonment of elected officials, provincial officials, and so forth. Against that backdrop, the AKP then adopted a strategy, and again, if I ever was able to pursue the Israel comparison with Turkey, I would say this is very similar to the Oslo strategy on the part of the Israelis, which is to say, here there's a local, legitimate civil society activist sector and leadership that's emerged and so forth. How can we sideline them? Let's go to the exiled or external leadership that has historic legitimacy, Öcalan, but is in jail and outside of those new networks that have formed and so on, and create a pact with that person to come to some kind of an accord amongst ourselves that basically, to some extent, marginalizes the incredibly important sort of work that's been done in coalition building and building up of civil society institutions and civic space in Kurdistan proper in Turkey, and marginalize the BDP. Now, the BDP has been brought in to some extent now in this dialogue, but the model has been, we're going to reach to the element, instead of finding an accommodation that's strictly political with actors that have embraced a civil political platform for Kurdish identity claims, let's go to the erstwhile violent head of leadership and negotiate with him and come up with some accord with him that re-legitimates one set of actors that we now control because he's in prison and we literally control him over these others that we do not. That strategy is very troubling, and the deployment of religion as you're with us or against us is also very troubling. And I think overall the Kurdish policies of the AKP have been generally negative. But at this moment, there does appear to be some kind of a transformation underway that's a consequence of the strategy, and whether it ends up being durable or has the kind of trajectory that Oslo had, one can't speak to. And then there are all kinds of other things, media freedom issues, relationship of civilian and military government and so forth, that aren't reflected necessarily through the lens of religion and secularism, but are certainly battles that are being heavily fought, and the AKP is very proud successor to Kemalist legacies of repression in all of those arenas, but has also been an innovator with respect to the institutional relationship with the military, and that has, I think, very long-term and potentially very constructive implications, even if, no matter what happens, whether the AKP stays in power, whether other governments come into power. I think there's been a definitive demotion of the military's role as the fourth branch of government that's, very constructive for the constitutional order.
Yes.
I'm curious about the current drafting process, which I think we've sort of been following tangentially, but not super closely. And I guess I'm just wondering to what degree you see the sort of secular, non-secular divide as a severe roadblock to that process going forward. Because it seems like there's this very thinly veiled threat that if the commission doesn't produce a draft, which it didn't, that Erdogan will just step in and produce his own draft, and then there's this sort of histrionic reaction of, if that happens, the next step is theocracy. And so I'm wondering to what extent that division is really what's preventing the process from going forward, or whether you see it as some other.
So I think this is as I was saying earlier, the Erdogan charismatic sort of appeal, both domestically and regionally, is troubling and diversionary in a variety of ways. And one thing it really critically diverts attention from is his own personal authoritarianism within his political party and his overall quite authoritarian approach to political institutions in the country, which is distinctive to him. I actually don't think it's necessarily a characteristic of the party. And I think one, potentially positive outcome if he secures the role of presidency, which seems to be still a goal, would be for him to cease to act, at least nominally cease to act as leader of the party, which might enable fragmentation of the party. And I think the best possible outcome for Turkish democracy would be the dividing up of the AKP into among its multiple currents. Because frankly, I think any time you get a tent as large as the AKP's is, consolidating all of the center-right, you're not ever going to have a genuine opposition that will be able to be meaningfully competitive. But that's not because there aren't ideological differences. They're just being somehow obscured by the existence of this giant tent. And I think that giant tent is being held together largely by, and I might be wrong about this, but my own impression is, as a non-AKP partisan, of course, I'm not sitting in on political party meetings and drawing these conclusions, but my impression is that he has a very important role in securing the ongoing cohesion of that big tent. And if that were to go away, you would get a tremendously more vibrant but fragmented political spectrum, which would produce the old pathologies that Israel, Italy, and others suffer from, of coalition governments that don't, none of the kind of durability that the last 12 years has produced, but that durability has come at a great cost as well, including the consolidation of these authoritarian tendencies within the party itself. I think the biggest obstacle that I can see currently to the constitutional process is that threat from Erdogan, which has nothing to do with a secular Islamist divide or anything else, but his own personal style of politics, which is anathema to what you would need to have a broad constitutional process that would actually generate a constitution with buy-in, namely an all-party accord mechanism in which you have very wide participation, which is something that the Turkish system has seen in previous amendment rounds, notably in 2000, but also in 2004. I mean, it's possible to have this. It's possible to take an approach in which all parties, and again, you have to worry about how you define this. Clearly, the threshold for parliamentary election and being seated in parliament is another obstacle to full representation. So you don't want to say just those parties that get seated in parliament, but you come up with a formula for deciding who is entitled to be at the table that's sufficiently inclusive to incorporate the political spectrum around a bargain, and then you actually engage in political bargaining. And the irony that this party is unwilling to engage in that bargaining when it holds all the cards at this point is outrageous, right? I mean, in previous iterations, they're the ones who've been excluded and have demanded access to a competitive bargaining space. What they actually produced in the 2010 referendum for the first time was the possibility of meaningfully competitive bargaining, because now you remove the veto player that the Turkish Constitutional Court was, which would basically constantly give a trump card to parties that wouldn't be able to generate electoral support, but could nonetheless get their viewpoint imposed through the Turkish Constitutional Court. But now you've removed that, you have the space that you've been demanding for political bargaining, and instead of using it, you are systematically threatening authoritarian results. That, again, suggests that my accidental Democrat story has only traction so far, because once you remove that obstacle, which was a genuine obstacle and was anti-democratic and did infect the previous constitutional bargaining process and caused, to the, I think, endless chagrin probably of liberals in Turkey, the demise of an excellent draft in 2007, now you have this process where the AKP, driven by this authoritarian personality, is opting constantly for these maximalist positions that undermine any kind of political bargain for compromise in which they would have the greatest leverage.
Why don't they try to impose a solution?
That is sort of what they're threatening, and the question is what the content of that would be. And I think part of the reason is, again, this would generate more fragmentation within the AKP, because they can't, when Erdogan engages in this threat, I don't think he's threatening to impose the Özbudun draft, which would actually then, even if they imposed it top down, it would actually command quite a lot of support, I think, as the 2011 referendum showed, right? Even when there's a kind of infected political process that produces the package that people are voting on, if the package has a content that's attractive, people will be able to overcome some of that aversion, including people not in the AKP camp. The AKP got a much larger vote of support for the referendum than it's ever had, despite its many electoral successes. It's never gained that share of the electorate. But I think Erdogan himself now wants to impose potentially a constitution that wouldn't be able to command that kind of support.
So can I just kind of pick up on this point? So what's interesting as an outside observer of the Turkish process is how the focus of the intensity of the debate has been greatest on the question of executive powers, right? And whether Turkey moves to a form of semi-presidentialism with a really strong president, right? Kind of Russia light, right? And so I'm wondering how that agenda intersects with this. This paper is about a different set of debates and issues that really doesn't touch upon that. And so I'm just wondering how you connect what Turkish constitutional politics seems to be about right now with these sets of debates, which have been long-standing in Turkey.
Well, I think, the stakes of the question of the degree to which Turkey moves to a more executive model is whether or not a party, even if it's not able to maintain the kind of big tent that produces durable parliamentary majorities, will nonetheless be able to take hostage a particular office that is strengthened in a way that enables them to continue to exact particular vision, regardless of its democratic pedigree. I think that's the concern today. Of course, this echoes the earlier concern in 2007, which was simply, at an earlier period, you have a very strong executive as it is, in the sense that the president had, first of all, very wide appointment powers prior to the 2011 referendum with respect to the judiciary, and also veto power over legislation, and a tremendous number of other, role in the National Security Council, all kinds of things already. And that was the reason that people were very keen to prevent Abdullah Gül from occupying this office. It wasn't that they were threatening a different kind of office. It was that this particular office was designed to be a check on democratic preferences to begin with. Now,
but it was indirectly elected, though, right?
Right, it was indirectly elected, but it was intended, the belief was that there will never come a time when a Kurd or an Islamist would be able to muster the parliamentary support necessary to get into that position. And so it was designed for Kenan Evren, and then it was historically occupied by people of that, of that line. And in fact, there had been another much earlier minor kerfuffle around Özal, and whether or not he was an appropriate kind of person to have this role, given what the role was supposed to be for. So they've already created this kind of empowered executive, and they initially were trying to preserve it as a mechanism to check the possibility of any kind of democratic reversal by getting these parties that could never actually themselves gain the presidency to build coalitions around single issues like the headscarf with other actors in parliament and somehow get through some legislation that was deemed anti-Kemalist or not sufficiently in keeping with ideological commitments of the state. That whole battle and everything associated with it was lost in the process from 2007 to the 2011 referendum. It's over. So now you have this empowered executive that isn't going to serve that form of check. But now the question is, what if it continues to serve an anti-democratic role in another guise? It can no longer serve that role exclusively in the service of particular Kemalist ideological commitments because a variety of litmus tests were taken away. It can't do it. But it can still serve as a check, especially if it's even further empowered. But even as it stands today, without greater empowerment, if you were able to have a direct election that would enable charismatic leaders coming out of one particular political strain that don't in the future command a majority in parliament, but can systematically get elected directly into the presidency. So I think that's the new set of concerns that are animating it. And it's interesting because initially it was, we need to maintain an anti-democratic check, and we have to preserve it from Islamist access. And now it's, oh my goodness, we have an anti-democratic check, and what if it exclusively ends up being accessible only to Islamists, not by virtue of some institutional design trick, but because of the particular nature of the political spectrum and the capacity of a single individual to garner a majority in direct elections for that particular office, even when the platform as a whole is not going to be able to do so for legislative elections.
So I think there was another question over here. Is that right? Earlier. Did you have a question? Yes.
A quick one. I wonder if there are any just kind of broad conclusions that you might draw from the Turkish experience or any of the other countries that you wrote on about kind of the overall ability to constitutionalize national identity, and if that has real staying power, or it's kind of inevitable that over time, with new elites and new demographic changes, that's just going to be chipped away at.
That's a really interesting question. So I think it's an undesirable political project to try to use a constitution to generate a national identity or any kind of effort. The whole project, this is not a conversation we're going to have now, but the whole bringing of nationalism to the region and the idea that nation is going to coincide with state has been the source of much of death and dislocation that one can trace in the region over the last 2 centuries. So I see nothing positive about efforts to internalize that through this institutional design mechanism or that, pedagogical effort or what have you. I think those are troubling. Having said that, there's another model of what national identity could be, which is a civic model. And that may have some greater promise. So in other words, the commitment to a particular kind of political formula where the identity is an identity related to a polity that's emptied of ethnic, racial, religious, et cetera, content. So it's not an effort to homogenize the actual underlying ascriptive identities of individuals. Having said that, I think there are limits to that project as well. Actually, there's a really interesting paper being written right now, or book, proto-book being written right now by someone at Cornell that's, again, a friend of many of the people around this table, Aziz Rana, which interrogates the way that the United States has transformed the Constitution into a form of civic nationalism that has actually quite destructive implications, because it's a way of reifying a set of mythologies about the Constitution and the bargain that, you know, distract or obscure from the ways in which political power is actually being exercised that is out of keeping with that constitutional tradition, and that has generated a kind of national security state in the name of an alleged commitment to constitutional liberalism that itself is very deleterious to that same form of liberalism. So I think even that move of saying, well, maybe what we can do is have a constitution that reflects a durable political bargain to which individuals are committed as a matter of civic identity, and that becomes the national project. But I think that there may be ways in which that too, I mean, investing too heavily in the idea that a constitutional text is a source of durable identity, I think may have destructive implications even in that context.
And I only ask that because it seems like that's what a lot of the fear of the drafting processes in the Middle East right now kind of center around, and why a lot of the debate is around the religious provisions instead of kind of larger, you know, government structure questions.
I kind of have two responses to that. I mean, the first is I'm not sure that's what the fears are about. I think the fears are more about distributional consequences about political power today, like who is going to be benefited by this particular institutional design, and what will that mean for electoral outcomes in the next few rounds, and questions like that that are less about abstract commitments to the content of durable national identity and more about actual political struggles on the ground. And then the second response I have is the kind of Nathan Brown response, which is to say, not that much may ride on the constitutional formula that ends up being adopted about Islam is the religion or a religion or what have you, a source, the source. A lot more depends on the actual actors and the forms of political bargain that end up getting struck. Now, the story I'm telling here I don't spend a lot of time on, the two constitutions of the 1920s in the Turkish context, because I guess like Nathan Brown, that what mattered more was the sort of institutional formulae that were crafted around the margins of the Constitution that had these path-dependent effects in the Turkish context. And I think that might be more the important crux of the story in some of these places, which is, I'm not saying constitutions don't matter, but I think investing that much, I'm questioning whether or not publics really do debate about this question because they're worried about broad stroke national identity as opposed to more fine-grained political bargains that are being struck at any given moment. And secondly, I think some of those bargains may be in ordinary politics and not so much defined or determined by what the constitutional document ultimately says.
With that, please join me in welcoming in thanking Asli Bâli
welcoming me to part two.
Yes. For a great talk.